The Problem of Pain. Copyright 1940. C.S. Lewis. A Harper One publication. To the Inklings. The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his. George MacDonald. Unspoken Sermons. First Series. Preface. When Mr. Ashley Simpson suggested to me the writing of this book, I asked leave to be allowed to write it anonymously, since if I were to say what I really thought about pain, I should be forced to make statements of such apparent fortitude that they would become ridiculous if anyone knew who made them. Anonymity was rejected as inconsistent with the series, but Mr. Sampson pointed out that I could write a preface explaining that I did not live up to my own principles. This exhilarating program I am now carrying out. Let me confess at once, in the words of good Walter Hilton, that throughout this book I feel myself so far from true feeling of that I speak, that I can not else but cry mercy and desire after it as I may. Yet for that very reason there is one criticism which cannot be brought against me. No one can say, he jests at scars who never felt a wound, for I have never for one moment been in a state of mind to which even the imagination of serious pain was less than intolerable. If any man is safe from the danger of underestimating this adversary, I am that man. I must add, too, that the only purpose of the book is to solve the intellectual problem raised by suffering. For the far higher task of teaching fortitude and patience, I was never fool enough to suppose myself qualified, nor have I anything to offer my readers except my conviction that when pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge, a little human sympathy more than much courage, and the least tincture of the love of God more than all. If any real theologian reads these pages, he will very easily see that they are the work of a layman and an amateur. Except in the last two chapters, parts of which are admittedly speculative, I have believed myself to be restating ancient and orthodox doctrines. If any parts of the book are original, in the sense of being novel or unorthodox, they are so against my will and as a result of my ignorance. I write, of course, as a layman of the Church of England, but I have tried to assume nothing that is not professed by all baptized and communicating Christians. As this is not a work of erudition, I have taken little pains to trace ideas or quotations to their sources when they were not easily recoverable. Any theologian will see easily enough what and how little I have read. C.S. Lewis. Introductory. I wonder at the hardihood with which such persons undertake to talk about God. In a treatise addressed to infidels, they begin with a chapter proving the existence of God from the works of nature. This only gives their readers grounds for thinking that the proofs of our religion are very weak. It is a remarkable fact that no canonical writer has ever used nature to prove God. Pascal. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you believe in God? Why do you not believe in God? My reply would have run something like this. Look at the universe we live in. By far, the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. The bodies which move in this space are so few and so small in comparison with the space itself that even if every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures, it would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than a byproduct to the power that made the universe. As it is, however, the scientists think it likely that very few of the suns of space, perhaps none of them except our own, have any planets, and in our own system it is improbable that any planet except the Earth sustains life. And Earth herself existed without life for millions of years, and may exist for millions more when life has left her. And what is it like while it lasts? It is so arranged that all the forms of it can live only by preying upon one another. In the lower forms this process entails only death. But in the higher, there appears a new quality called consciousness, which enables it to be attended with pain. The creatures cause pain by being born and live by inflicting pain, and in pain they mostly die. In the most complex of all the creatures, man, yet another quality appears, which we call reason, whereby he is enabled to foresee his own pain, which henceforth is preceded with acute mental suffering, and to foresee his own death, while keenly desiring permanence. It also enables men by 100 ingenious contrivances to inflict a great deal more pain than they otherwise could have done on one another and on the irrational creatures. This power they have exploited to the full. Their history is largely a record of crime, war, disease, and terror, with just such sufficient happiness interposed to give them, while it lasts, an agonized apprehension of losing it, and, when it is lost, the poignant misery of remembering. Every now and then they improve their condition a little, and what we call a civilization appears. But all civilizations pass away, and even while they remain, inflict peculiar sufferings of their own, probably sufficient to outweigh their alleviations they may have brought to the normal pains of man. That our own civilization has done so, no one will dispute. That it will pass away like all its predecessors is surely probable. Even if it should not, what then? The race is doomed. Every race that comes into being in any part of the universe is doomed, for the universe, they tell us, is running down, and will sometime be a uniform infinity of homogeneous matter at a low temperature. All stories will come to nothing, all life will turn out in the end to have been a transitory and senseless contortion upon the idiotic face of infinite matter. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. So ends the quote. So here is Lewis before he was a Christian, telling you why he's not. The atheist, giving you his best reason for what supports his atheism. And it's a spirit that you hear often, right? Maybe not articulated quite so eloquently, laid out with round sentences, complete thoughts, but that's the general tenor, right? Life is meaningless, the universe is cold, it's indifferent to our sufferings and our happinesses, our meanings and our joys.
You're saying that most atheists believe this?
In one way or another, right. Like I said, perhaps they couldn't articulate it in quite that eloquent fashion, but they could. That would be something like what they would say if they could write and speak like Lewis. And even if they're not full-on atheists, that's kind of a general nihilistic view that sort of permeates the modern age, right? So Lewis obviously doesn't believe this now, otherwise he wouldn't be writing this book. But I am glad that he includes things like this, because we get to see that Lewis doesn't come to Christianity merely through the training of childhood, like so many people do. We get to see him coming to Christianity from from the position of a non-believer, a true non-believer, right? Not just
a mature non-believer.
Maybe that's a better way to put it. Yeah, a mature non-believer. So he goes on here. There was one question which I never dreamed of raising. I never noticed that the very strength and facility of the pessimist's case at once poses us a problem. If the universe is so bad, or even half so bad, how on earth did human beings ever come to attribute it to the activity of a wise and good creator? How did people ever start thinking this was the product of a god, if it is so very bad? Men are fools, perhaps, but hardly so foolish as that. The direct inference from black to white, from evil flower to virtuous root, from senseless work to a workman infinitely wise, staggers belief. The spectacle of the universe, as revealed by experience, can never have been the ground of religion. It must always have been something in spite of which religion, acquired from a different source, was held. It would be an error to reply that our ancestors were ignorant and therefore entertained pleasing illusions about nature which the progress of science has since dispelled. For centuries, during which all men believed, the nightmare size and emptiness of the universe was already known. You will read in some books that the men of the Middle Ages thought the earth flat and the stars near, but that is a lie. Ptolemy, who had told them that the earth was a mathematical point without size, Ptolemy had told them that the earth was a mathematical point without size in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, a distance which one medieval popular text estimates at 117 million miles. And in times yet earlier, even from the beginnings, men must have got the same sense of hostile immensity from a more obvious source. To prehistoric man, the neighboring forest must have been infinite enough. and the utterly alien, and infest, which we have to fetch from the thought of cosmic rays and cooling suns, came snuffing and howling nightly to his very doors. Certainly, at all periods, the pain and waste of human life was equally obvious. Our own religion begins among the Jews, a people squeezed between great warlike empires, continually defeated and led captive, familiar as Poland or Armenia with the tragic story of the conquered. It is mere nonsense to put pain among the discoveries of science. Lay down this book and reflect for 5 minutes on the fact that all the great religions were first preached and long practiced in a world without chloroform. So that seems to be a temper that a lot of people have about the past, an attitude that they have toward the past, that men of the past were just stupid, and that's why they must have believed in a god, or that's why they must have constructed stories about the gods or a god, because they were just too dumb. They were just too ignorant of the universe and its workings to understand what we understand now. Lewis puts this in a proper light because he says, well, you need to reflect that the size and immensity of the universe was known to man, even back then. Not to the exact measurement that it is to us, right? We know roughly how old it is even. Maybe not to the day or to the hour, but we do know generally, and when you're talking about billions of years, 100 or 200 million years is close enough. We know generally how old the universe is and generally how big it is, or at least how big it seems to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that size, the size of the universe, being something that was unknown, well, that's not the case. He brings up Ptolemy. Ptolemy was practicing his craft 2,400 years ago, and knew that the Earth must have been an insignificant mathematical point in relation to how far away the stars were. Now, maybe they didn't know exactly what the stars were, what made them work like we do, but they knew something. They knew something was out there and that it was bigger than them, and probably much, much, much bigger. And even if they didn't, Lewis goes on to say, what about the hunter who just lived near the forest? The forest was big enough, compared to a man, to make him feel small. Even today, if you took all of human beings alive on the planet right now, they could easily fit in Alaska with plenty of room to live. I'm bringing that up because the Earth is a big enough place, is what I mean, to make you feel small. Even if you just take Earth as all that there is. If you understood that as an ancient person, that Earth is all there is, you would have been wrong, but if that was your understanding, that was enough to make you feel small. Because you are small in relation to it. You stand out and look out at an ocean, or a mountain range, or even a forest, like Lewis says, and your smallness is apparent. It's not something that's foreign to you. So, ancient man wasn't this stupid, dumb thing we presume him to be. For one thing, he had the same level of intelligence, at least capability, that we do. I mean, man from several million years really has had this same capacity. 200,000 years, as I understand it, the same mental capacity to think and reason. Our brains have been about this size for a long time. So it's not like ancient man wasn't working with the same tools. His knowledge may not have been as great as ours, but his understanding of his finitude was certainly at least at our level and maybe greater. So we can't assume him to be dumb. So how and why did he create religions? Lewis goes on to say here that all of the great religions came about in a time when there was no painkillers, no chloroform. So it's not like these people were unfamiliar with pain. Great pain was suffered, and it had to be suffered full in the face. Unlike with us, where we can mediate it some with pain-killing pharmaceuticals or just with the general comforts that we are surrounded by, like air conditioning, for example. So, ancient man was, well, he was no dummy. Lewis goes on to say, at all times, then, an inference from the course of events in this world to the goodness and wisdom of the Creator would have been equally preposterous. It would have been stupid for man to believe that this world of suffering that we inhabit, this world of smallness, or this world of largeness where we are very, very small, was the product of an infinitely wise and good creator. And it was never made, he says. Note, in other words, never made at the beginnings of religion. After belief in God has been accepted, theodicies, explaining or explaining away the miseries of life, will naturally appear often enough. Religion has a different origin. In what follows, it must be understood that I am not primarily arguing the truth of Christianity, but describing its origin, a task, in my view, necessary if we are to put the problem of pain in its right setting. In all developed religion, we find 3 strands or elements, and in Christianity 1 more. The first of these is what Professor Otto calls the experience of the numinous. Those who have not met this term may be introduced to it by the following device. Suppose you were told there was a tiger in the next room. You would know that you were in danger and would probably feel fear. But if you were told there is a ghost in the next room, and believed it, you would feel indeed what is often called fear, but of a different kind. It would not be based on the knowledge of danger, for no one is primarily afraid of what a ghost may do to him, but of the mere fact that it is a ghost. It is uncanny rather than dangerous, and the special kind of fear it excites may be called dread. With the uncanny, one has reached the fringes of the numinous. Now suppose that you were told simply, there is a mighty spirit in the room, and believed it. Your feelings would then be even less like the mere fear of danger, but the disturbance would be profound. You would feel wonder and a certain shrinking, a sense of inadequacy to cope with such a visitant, and of a prostration before it, an emotion which might be expressed in Shakespeare's words, "Under it, my genius is rebuked." This feeling may be described as awe, and the object which excites it as the numinous. So now we have a definition to work with in this book. The numinous. The numinous is the fear, or the awe, or the
humility.
Humility, yes, even a better word, that we often feel in the presence of something greater. And in this case, much, much greater, in that it is a spirit. So something not on the same physical plane that we are. Now, nothing is more certain than that man, from a very early period, began to believe that the universe was haunted by spirits. Professor Otto perhaps assumes too easily that from the very first such spirits were regarded with numinous awe. This is impossible to prove, for the very good reason that utterances expressing awe of the numinous and utterances expressing mere fear of danger may use identical language, as we can still say that we are afraid of a ghost or afraid of a rise in prices. It is therefore theoretically possible that there was a time when men regarded these spirits simply as dangerous and felt towards them just as they felt towards tigers. What is certain is that now, at any rate, the numinous experience exists, and that if we start from ourselves, we can trace it a long way back. A modern example may be found, if we are not too proud to seek it there, in the wind in the willows, where Rat and Mole approach Pan on the island. "Rat," he found breath to whisper, shaking, "are you afraid?" "Afraid?" murmured the Rat, his eyes shining with unutterable love. "Afraid? Of him? Oh, never, never. And yet, oh Mole, I am afraid." Going back about a century, we find copious examples in Wordsworth, perhaps the finest being that passage in the first book of the Prelude, where he describes his experience while rowing on the lake in the stolen boat. Going back further, we get a very pure and strong example in Malory, when Galahad began to tremble right hard when the deadly, or read mortal, flesh began to behold the spiritual things. At the beginning of our era, it finds expression in the Apocalypse, what we call the Revelation in the New Testament, where the writer fell at the feet of the risen Christ as one dead. In pagan literature, we find Ovid's picture of the dark grove on the Aventine Hill, of which you would say at a glance, "Numen inest," the place is haunted, or there is a presence here. And Virgil gives us the palace of Latinus, awful, with woods and sanctity of elder days. A Greek fragment attributed, but improbably, to Aeschylus tells us of earth, sea, and mountain shaking beneath the dread eye of their master. And far further back, Ezekiel tells us of the rings in his theophany that were so high they were dreadful. And Jacob, rising from sleep, says, "How dreadful is this place." So these are all examples of the contact with the numinous, a dread, a fear, a humility that's so great it humbles you, bows you down, right? Think of the Lord of the Rings, where there's a situation like this where Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn are in the forest of Fangorn, and Legolas says to Aragorn, "There's something out there." He says this forest is full of anger and bad memories. And it's this fear of a presence that's captured them, right? That they're in the presence of this, and really their weapons, as they're all three great warriors, are kind of useless against. Lewis goes on to say, "We do not know how far back in human history this feeling goes. The earliest men almost certainly believed in things which would excite the feeling in us if we believed in them, and it seems therefore probable that numinous awe is as old as humanity itself. But our main concern is not with its dates. The important thing is that somehow or other it has come into existence, and is widespread, and does not disappear from the mind with the growth of knowledge and civilization. It doesn't matter how smart you are, you can still feel that dread." Now, this awe is not the result of an inference from the visible universe. There is no possibility of arguing from mere danger to the uncanny, still less to the fully numinous. You may say that it seems to you very natural that early man, being surrounded by real dangers and therefore frightened, should invent the uncanny and the numinous. In a sense it is. But let us understand what we mean. You feel it to be natural because, sharing human nature with your remote ancestors, you can imagine yourself reacting to perilous solitudes in the same way. And this reaction is indeed natural, in the sense of being in accord with human nature. But it is not the least natural, in the sense that the idea of the uncanny or the numinous is already contained in the idea of the dangerous, or that any perception of danger, or any dislike of the wounds and death which it may entail, could give the slightest conception of ghostly dread or numinous awe to an intelligence which did not already understand them. So he says, in other words, you see it as likely that mankind in the past leapt from what is dangerous to what is numinous, because you can imagine yourself leaping in your thought from what is dangerous to what is numinous. But it's very difficult, if not impossible, to
put yourself in a place where you didn't know what you now know.
What you now know, exactly. In other words, to shed your human nature for a moment and see whether that would be a reasonable assumption, to go from the dangerous to the numinous. He says this isn't something you're really able to do because you can't shed your human nature. In other words, you're kind of just in the water, right? You can't help but be in the water. Does a fish know it's in the water? Right? It's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to shed this, jump off your shadow, and think things through from a completely objective standpoint. In this case, objective meaning not human. When man passes from physical fear to dread and awe, he makes a sheer jump and apprehends something which could never be given, as danger is, by the physical facts and logical deductions from them. Most attempts to explain the numinous presuppose the thing to be explained, as when anthropologists derive it from fear of the dead, without explaining why dead men, assuredly the least dangerous kind of men, should have attracted this peculiar feeling. Well, this is something anthropologists will often say about where this feeling came from. They'll say, well, human beings looked at their dead ancestors laying there on the ground and thought, and derived their fear of the numinous or their feeling of the numinous from the fact of their dead ancestor laying there. But surely, if human beings did not already possess that sensation of the numinous, why would they look at something dead, which is surely the least dangerous kind of thing, because it's no longer a threat,
and extract awe from that?
And extract awe from it, exactly. If we didn't already have this sense of the numinous. Why is it that a dead body would excite that in us? Against all such attempts, we must insist that dread and awe are in a different dimension from fear. They are in the nature of an interpretation man gives to the universe, or an impression he gets from it. And just as no enumeration of the physical qualities of a beautiful object could ever include its beauty, or give the faintest hint of what we mean by beauty to a creature without aesthetic experience, so no factual description of any human environment could include the uncanny and the numinous, or even hint at them. If you wanted to describe something beautiful to someone, you couldn't, and let's say this person or this thing, maybe it's an alien from another planet, so an entity completely different from us, and you were trying to describe beauty to this creature. Merely listing or enumerating the qualities of the thing that you consider to be beautiful to this creature wouldn't do it, right? If you were trying to describe a beautiful scene from a range of mountains, or a flower, or a beautiful woman, or a beautiful person in general, you couldn't necessarily include the idea of the beauty just by enumerating its qualities, just by listing its qualities. And in the same way, he says we must reject any attempt to enumerate or to describe the sense of the numinous simply by enumerating its qualities like this. It is also sort of beyond that sort of explanation. There seem, in fact, to be only two ways we can hold about awe. There seem to be, in fact, only two views we can hold about awe. Either it is a mere twist in the human mind, corresponding to nothing objective and serving no biological function, yet showing no tendency to disappear from that mind at its fullest development in poet, philosopher, or saint, or else it is a direct experience of the really supernatural, to which the name revelation might properly be given. The numinous is not the same as the morally good, and a man overwhelmed with awe is likely, if left to himself, to think the numinous object beyond good and evil. He's quoting Nietzsche here. This brings us to the second strand or element in religion. All the human beings that history has heard of acknowledge some kind of morality. That is, they feel towards certain proposed actions the experiences expressed by the words, I ought, or I ought not. These experiences resemble awe in one respect, namely, that they cannot be logically deduced from the environment and physical experiences of the man who undergoes them. You can shuffle, I want, and I am forced, and I shall be well advised, and I dare not, as long as you please, without getting out of them the slightest hint of ought and ought not. So we can exchange phrases here, right? We can say I want something in an attempt to shuffle out I ought or I ought not. Or we can say I am forced to do something, or it's good advice for me to do this, I shall be well advised, or I dare not do that. But the same sense is not there. We can't simply exchange the meaning of the word ought, should. We can't exchange that with any other phrasing. There's a sense there that can't be captured by any other words. I should do this. What is it exactly we're referencing when we say I should?
Like a moral tugging on our heart.
That's right. We are tapping on a moral touchstone that is beyond our ability to necessarily articulate, but we feel it. And all civilizations have. That's what's curious about it. It's common to human experience, no matter where you go.
It's universal.
It's universal. And it is one of the few things that is universal. There are things about human nature that are universal. There are a lot of differences, civilization to civilization, culture to culture. But one thing, among a very small list of things that does remain a constant, is a moral imperative to do a thing or not to do a thing. Seems to be something that is just intrinsic to what it means to be human.
Well, what do you say to people who would argue that it's a reaction that comes about because at some level you could benefit from doing this thing?
Well, I would say that
bad outcome.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the things that people say they should or they shouldn't do are are not apparently beneficial to an individual. In fact, they are often things that come at great personal cost. So, for instance, it might be advisable, or it might be selfishly advisable to lie. It might serve your purposes, to lie, whatever those purposes might be. It might also serve your purposes to stab your friend in the back. But you feel that you shouldn't. So, a violation of some morality that you hold is often personally beneficial, at least for the foreseeable future. And yet, despite that very obvious advantage, we still say, even if we don't act on, the feeling of, I ought or I ought not. I should or I shouldn't. And once again, attempts to resolve the moral experience into something else always presuppose the very thing they are trying to explain, as when a famous psychoanalyst deduces it from prehistoric parricide. If the parricide produced a sense of guilt, killing one's parents, that is, that's what parricide is, that was because men felt that they ought not to have committed it. If they did not so feel, it could produce no sense of guilt. So where did the sense of guilt come from? Morality, like numinous awe, is a jump. In it, man goes beyond anything that can be given in the facts of experience. And it has one characteristic too remarkable to be ignored. The moralities accepted among men may differ, though not at bottom so widely as is often claimed, but they all agree in prescribing a behavior which their adherents fail to practice. So there's a law, a moral standard that the adherents of this belief, the people who say they are believers in or followers of this religion, standard, morality, culture, they fail to live up to it. All men alike stand condemned, not by alien codes of ethics, but by their own, and all men therefore are conscious of guilt. The second element in religion is the consciousness not merely of moral law, but of moral law at once approved and disobeyed. So there's guilt, right? Not just a sense of moral law, but also a sense of having violated it. This consciousness is neither a logical nor an illogical inference from the facts of experience. If we did not bring it to our experience, we could not find it there. It is either inexplicable illusion or else revelation. So we bring this sense of guilt, this sense of ought and ought not, to our experiences. The experiences don't teach us these things. In other words, it's inborn. We come with this sensation ready-made. It's almost like a feature that comes standard with every human. You might say this when you're buying a car. This feature is standard. Even the most basic version of this car comes with this feature. It seems that a sense of moral guilt comes standard with being a human.
You're saying that this is God's mark on us.
Well, I think that we could probably make that leap, yeah, and say that this is whatever the mark of God on us means. That surely seems to be part of it. Lewis goes on to say the moral experience and the numinous experience are so far from being the same that they may exist for quite long periods without establishing a mutual contact. In many forms of paganism, the worship of the gods and the ethical discussions of the philosophers have very little to do with each other. The third stage in religious development arises when men identify them, when the numinous power to which they feel awe is made the guardian of the morality to which they feel obligation. You can find this in paganism. The worshippers of paganism, the practicers of paganism, felt awe towards the gods. They did. They felt awe towards, and we can see this in like their reactions to holy sites or sacred sites like Delphi or Olympus itself, or the fact that they put their temples on high places. In Athens, it was the Acropolis, the highest place in the city. Why? Because it was a place of reverence. Higher meant better. Higher meant, I don't know if higher for them meant holier, but at least meant more powerful. Because there is a difference, and that's the difference he's trying to derive here. He says, awe, numinous awe, and moral obligation don't necessarily have to go together. And in fact, many religions, like the Greek religion that I've just been mentioning here, had numinous awe towards the gods without a sense of moral obligation tied to that numinous awe. The Greeks did not see their gods as lawgivers. Neither did the Egyptians. Neither did the Germanic tribes who had their Nordic system of polytheism. They didn't see their gods as having handed down a law that they needed to follow. They were powerful and fearful and deserving of great respect, and even the need to appease them existed. But living up to a standard that they had set, that was not something that was there in these systems. The third stage in religious development arises when men identify them, when the numinous power to which they feel awe is made the guardian of the morality to which they feel obligation. Once again, this may seem to you very natural. What can be more natural than for a savage haunted at once by awe and by guilt to think that the power which awes him is also the authority which condemns his guilt? And it is indeed natural to humanity, but it is not in the least obvious. The actual behavior of that universe which the numinous haunts bears no resemblance to the behavior which morality demands of us. This is an interesting point, because we look out at the universe and perhaps we would feel awe at that feeling of smallness that we have in relation to it, right? Standing and looking at the night sky and knowing, even if you don't know exactly how large it is, like modern man does know in certain books or in certain circles, at the very least, you know it's a whole lot bigger than you are. So that feeling of numinous awe, of dread, of humility in the face of it, doesn't necessarily have to mean whatever power that is that's making me feel this is also the power that I owe allegiance to. And that allegiance comes in the form of following its dictates, following its moral code. Those things are not necessarily related. It's not obvious that those two things are connected. And the proof of that is the religions that we've been listing. Most of the religions of the past, certainly the polytheistic ones, though they had very colorful descriptions of the numinous awe in the descriptions of who the gods were and what their behaviors were like and the stories of the practices they engaged in. It was practically a soap opera of what the gods did in their spare time. No contact with moral obligation was ever drawn from polytheistic gods who are very powerful and could and need to be appeased in some way, usually through sacrifices. No contact was drawn between that and I must do a thing that this god commands. The one seems wasteful, ruthless, and unjust. The other enjoins upon us the opposite qualities. So when we look out at that universe that has this vastness to it and humbles us with its vastness and our smallness in relation to it, that universe's behaviors, that universe's goings on, don't really have a way to convince us of morality either. Like when we look out at that universe, awe we feel, smallness we feel, but observing that universe for very long at all doesn't really give us a sense that morality is a big part of what's going on in the universe. In fact, what we see is predation. We see one thing preying on another. We see coldness. We see unfeeling exchanges of energy. We don't really see any morality there. We can watch The Lion King and feel like the pride of lions has some sort of moral code to it. But this is a ruthless environment.
Yeah.
In reality. We're bringing our humanity to that cartoon ready-made when we watch it. And good, I like the story. I like the morals in it. But we have to realize what's going on there. The universe makes us feel dread. It makes us feel humility. But it doesn't teach us any morals, because it doesn't have any. It is an amoral thing. It's not immoral either. It's just amoral. There are no morals. It's cold and unfeeling and indifferent. Some of the things that Lewis outlined in his pre-Christian atheist diatribe to start the book. He goes on to say here, nor can the identification of the two be explained as a wish fulfillment, for it fulfills no one's wishes. We desire nothing less than to see the law, whose naked authority is already unsupportable, armed with the incalculable claims of the numinous. Like, this doesn't make anybody happy, right? That this thing that we feel dread in the face of, this thing that we feel humility in the face of, also has a claim on our moral obligations. Nobody wishes for this, right? Because it means that this thing that's very powerful is also very demanding. That's not really all that comforting, because it puts you in a position of obligation. It's not exactly fun to have your desires and your wishes curtailed by a moral law that you should follow, despite feeling or wanting to do something else. So it's not a wish fulfillment here. Lewis says of all the jumps that humanity takes in its religious history, this is certainly the most surprising. It is not unnatural that many sections of the human race refused it. Non-moral religion and non-religious morality existed and still exist. There's plenty of non-moral religions. There's plenty of non-religious morality. Perhaps only a single people, as a people, took the new step with perfect decision. I mean the Jews. But great individuals in all times and places have taken it also, and only those who take it are safe from the obscenities and barbarities of unmoralized worship or the cold, sad self-righteousness of sheer moralism. Judged by its fruits, this step is a step towards increased health, and though logic does not compel us to take it, it is very hard to resist. Even on paganism and pantheism, morality is always breaking in, and even Stoicism finds itself willy-nilly bowing the knee to God, maybe in humility. Once more, it may be madness, a madness congenital to man and oddly fortunate in its results, or it may be revelation. And if revelation, then it is most really and truly in Abraham that all people shall be blessed. This is the promise made to Abraham by God. He says that in your seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. For it was the Jews, Lewis goes on, who fully and unambiguously identified the awful presence, capital P, haunting black mountain tops and thunder clouds with the righteous Lord, who loveth righteousness. This isn't just a righteous Lord, he loves righteousness. In other words, he demands it in all creatures, and particularly man. The fourth strand, or element, is a historical event. There was a man born among these Jews who claimed to be, or to be the son of, or to be one with, the something which is at once the awful haunter of nature and the giver of the moral law. The claim is so shocking, a paradox, and even a horror, which we may easily be lulled into taking too lightly, that only two views of this man are possible. Either he was a raving lunatic of unusually abominable type, or else he was, and is, precisely what he said. There is no middle way. If the records make the first hypothesis unacceptable, you must submit to the second. That Jesus was either a raving lunatic who thought he was a god, or he was what he says he is. You can't really have it both ways. I like his morals, therefore I'm willing to put up with his megalomania. If the records that we have, Lewis says, make the first thing, the idea that he was a raving lunatic, unacceptable, then we are left with nothing but to accept the second possibility, that he was who he says he is, or that he was who he says he was. And if you do that, Lewis goes on, all else that is claimed by Christians becomes credible. That this man, having been killed, was yet alive, and that his death, in some manner incomprehensible to human thought, has affected a real change in our relations to the awful and righteous Lord, and a change in our favor. To ask whether the universe as we see it looks more like the work of a wise and good creator or the work of chance, indifference, or malevolence is to omit from the outset all the relevant factors in the religious problem. Christianity is not the conclusion of a philosophical debate on the origins of the universe. It is a catastrophic historical event following on the long spiritual preparation of humanity which I have described. It is not a system into which we have to fit the awkward fact of pain. It is itself one of the awkward facts which have to be fitted into any system we make. In a sense, it creates, rather than solves, the problem of pain. For pain would be no problem unless, side by side with our daily experience of this painful world, we had received what we think a good assurance that ultimate reality is righteous and loving. That's why we see pain as a problem, because we have this idea to juxtapose it with. We have this idea that the universe is, the ultimate reality, rather, not the universe, is righteous and loving. That the spring, the fountainhead from which all life and goodness springs, is itself righteous and good. That God, if we want to label it, is righteous and good. That is what presents the problem of pain. If we didn't have this idea, that the universe or the ultimate reality was really righteous and good, the fact that pain exists would cause us no problem at all, because the universe is riddled with it. It's riddled with pain and suffering all the time. It's the fact that we think, despite pain existing, that the ultimate reality is righteous and good, that pain becomes a problem. It's us comparing our painful experience with our apprehension or our belief that the ultimate fact of the universe is righteous and good presents a problem. If we didn't have this idea, then pain wouldn't be a problem at all.
Whether it was uppercase G gods or lowercase G.
Whatever, right. We have this idea in our minds, and most humans seem to, that ultimate reality, ultimate facthood is righteous and good. And then we compare that with our daily experience, which is full of pain. And this is a problem. This is what presents the problem. This is, it's often raised. The problem of pain is often raised in those terms by people. They'll say, how can you believe in a good God when so many people suffer? And one of my favorite actors, actually, Stephen Fry, absolutely brilliant guy, really funny, and a great actor to boot, raises just this problem in his discussions on philosophy. He'll say, I can't believe in a God, in a good God, when an innocent child can have brain cancer. I can't do it. And this is, by all measures, a very intelligent person, a very learned person. So it's raised in these terms. He is saying, the problem of pain is that I have this idea that existence should be righteous. And yet, my experience says, here is this unjust thing that's happening. So you want me to believe in a just God when such injustice is allowed to exist? I can't do it.
You're saying that he's using the spiritual language to describe his anger at the
assertion that God exists and that God is good. Yeah. What he's doing is he's talking in a circle because, and I feel great sympathy for him, because his mark of God is causing him to demand justice, and he should. But his mark of God is being twisted in a way that rejects God at the same time. Without that mark of God, without that sense that things ought to be just, he would never see a problem with a 5-year-old with brain cancer. That wouldn't be a problem for him, right? It's this sense of justice and righteousness that he has, that the universe ought to be constituted this way, and yet my experience says it isn't, that causes him to have anger or hatred, even loathing for the idea that such a situation was created by a good God.
Does is he knowledgeable? Has he read? I'm sure he's read the Bible, right?
I can't imagine he hasn't.
And when he read Genesis uh, and saw that it reads that man is responsible for the pain brought on himself, or
Well, I
that.
mean, I don't know what he thinks of that particular idea, but my guess is that he, like so many other atheists, would say, still, what has that got to do with this innocent child suffering when God, who is good and presumably all powerful, could stop it?
Hmm.
Lewis goes on to say, why this assurance seems to me good, I have more or less indicated. It does not amount to logical compulsion. At every stage of religious development, man may rebel, if not without violence to his own nature, yet without absurdity. He can close his spiritual eyes against the numinous, if he is prepared to part company with half the great poets and prophets of his race, with his own childhood, with the richness and depth of uninhibited experience. He can regard the moral law as an illusion, and so cut himself off from the common ground of humanity. He can refuse to identify the numinous with the righteous and remain a barbarian, worshipping sexuality, or the dead, or the life force, or the future. This is something that our ancestors did in spades. This is what the worshippers of polytheism did, the people we've been talking about, referencing. They had a sense of the dread of the numinous, but this manifested itself in the worship of the life force, or sexuality, or sexual experience, right? Or the natural processes of the earth, like the planting and harvesting of the grain. So he says, in that sense, he would be a barbarian. He can remain a barbarian, worshiping sexuality, or the dead, or the life force, or the future, which is what the Nazis did, right? They worshipped a life force, a future. The future is something that you can see the communists worshiping. But the cost is heavy, and when we come to the last step of all, the historical incarnation, the assurance is strongest of all. The story is strangely like many myths which have haunted religion from the first, and yet it is not like them. It is not transparent to the reason. We could not have invented it ourselves. It is not the suspicious a priori lucidity of pantheism or of Newtonian physics. It has the seemingly arbitrary and idiosyncratic character which modern science is slowly teaching us to put up with in this willful universe, where energy is made up in little parcels of a quantity no one could predict, where speed is not unlimited, where irreversible entropy gives time a real direction, and the cosmos, no longer static or cyclic, moves like a drama from a real beginning to a real end. If any message from the core of reality ever were to reach us, we should expect to find it in just that unexpectedness, that willful, dramatic, and fractuosity which we find in the Christian faith. It has the master touch, the rough, male taste of reality, not made by us, or indeed for us, but hitting us in the face. If, on such grounds, or on better ones, we follow the course on which humanity has been led, and become Christians, we then have the problem of pain.